Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today I have a special treat for you guys. I'm joined by an esteemed professor, Dr. Dale Tuggy. Welcome to the show there, Dale.
Hey, thanks for having me. I am an ex-professor, however, but I was for 18 years.
Okay, excellent. Well, nonetheless, you're still an esteemed guest on the show there. I know you've come highly recommended to me from a couple of my listeners, so I'll just name drop them. David Kemble Cook, who sort of made the initial contact for me, and also Arthur Jeffries, the Catholic, is a fan of your work on the Trinities Podcast. But yeah, I think before we say anything about today's topic, why don't we get to know you? Why don't you introduce us as to who you are, and give us a sense of your faith journey and that sort of thing.
Sure. Yeah, I was born and raised in Dallas, Texas, and I grew up in a good evangelical home. I was born again and baptized when I was almost 8 years old. Growing up, my family went to exactly two different churches. One was charismatic, independent charismatic, and one was very anti-charismatic. It was kind of related to Dallas Seminary a little bit. There were some people in common there. And so I just had kind of just standard American evangelical views about the Trinity, for instance. And honestly, it didn't really come up very much, only in refuting the cult's context did it come up. But I bought into the view that, look, you can very easily deduce the Trinity from the Bible, and these cults, they just don't believe the Bible, or they refuse to believe things they can't fully explain. And if they would just but submit to Scripture, they would see that all this is very obvious. But still, I hadn't really thought about it very much. I started thinking about this subject when I was in my PhD program for philosophy. So I went to Biola University, the evangelical university in Southern California, got a degree in philosophy there, loved it, had a great time. Got a 2-year master's at the Claremont Graduate University in California. And then I went to Brown University for my PhD in philosophy. Had a great time there as well. And when I was there, I read a couple of interesting books that really got me thinking. One was Richard Swinburne's book called The Christian God, where he tries to make sense out of the creedal tradition. And he comes up with something that a lot of people would say is really tritheism. But that's another conversation. And then in the bowels of the Brown University Library, I found what I now consider to be a lost classic, which was Samuel Clarke's book called The Scripture Doctrine of the Trinity. And that really got me thinking, and I think he decisively shows that in the New Testament, the one true God is the Father, not the Trinity. And but still, I didn't really know what I thought about it. When I was a young professor around the year 2000, I became aware that different Christian analytic theologians, people like Brian Leftow and William Lane Craig and Richard Swinburne, they were trying to get in there and show how the Trinity was coherent, and not just that it's not contradictory, but show that, it's plausible given Christian assumptions, and, kind of makes sense in a way, not that they could explain everything. And I started to realize that really what there is in mainstream tradition is required language, and then you're just kind of on your own to make sense of that language. And so that's why you have these leading Christian intellectuals coming up with these incompatible theories about what this language means. And so I tried on all of these theories. I wanted one of them to be true. I was essentially engaging in defensive apologetics, like, hey, this has to make sense, right? Scripture obviously teaches this. Scripture is inspired and true, so it must make sense. There must be a good way to defend this and present it intelligibly. But then once I realized that the Bible doesn't talk about a Trinity, but it says that the one true God is the Father, and I realized eventually that that's incompatible with the one true God being the Trinity. And so as the 2000s went along, eventually I came out, hey, sorry, I don't think that the Bible is Trinitarian in what it teaches. And that got me blackballed to some extent, but that's what I've published on, is kind of dueling Trinity theories because there's so many ways you can understand this language about one God and three persons sharing one essence. Again, you come up with these incompatible theories that just logically couldn't all be true. So bottom line, I've always been an evangelical. I value the Bible. When Bible clashes with Catholic traditions, I say the Bible has to win because I think God revealed as much as needed to be revealed to Jesus and the apostles. And so I'm not a Trinitarian because I see New Testament teaching as incompatible with it.
Excellent. But yeah, we're going to be discussing the Trinity, and specifically my guest Dale T. He wanted to focus on the model that I think works is a coherent model. That's the Trinity Monotheism model. But before we get into that, I did just want to ask. So I get from your opening statement, you're what's called a Unitarian Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I was wondering, do you mind? You've kind of explained how you got there and that sort of thing, but I'm just sort of curious, without going into too much detail. Do you think that the Unitarian concept of God is essential to being a Christian? Like, are Trinitarians going to hell in your view, or do you have a wider? Does your views of Christianity proper, so to speak, include Trinitarians?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. No, I don't think that having these precise theologies can be necessary to being saved. I think that what you have to believe to be saved is very minimal. It's basically what you see preached in Acts. And the thing is, you can mix that together with all kinds of other traditions, some of which maybe don't fit it. But, thank God he's merciful enough to admit people with beliefs that don't really go together well. Because if he wasn't like that, we'd all probably be in trouble. So to me, if you accept the basics, again, basically what you see in the Apostles' Creed, Jesus is God's Christ. He died for our sins and was raised by God and exalted. And that if we will confess him as Lord, that is, confess him as the Lord Messiah, we can be forgiven and born again. I think that's what's required. It's what evangelicals tell little kids that come down, to be saved at a camp meeting or something. They don't inform them about the Trinity and the two natures of Christ, or that you got to stay away from those dastardly oneness guys. I mean, I'm good. I'm not anti-intellectual. I'm as intellectual as you could possibly be. But I don't think those things are necessary for being received into God's family in Christ. They just can't be, because a kid of 7 can make the deal, right? And he's not taught these things.
Yeah.
So no, I don't think Trinitarians are going to hell or not Christians. I just think that they have beliefs that need further reforming.
Gotcha. Yeah. That is something, when I was doing my research and listening to sort of debates, I did think that's an interesting point that you bring up for those of us who do think that the Trinity, some kind of Trinitarian model is essential to Christianity. How often does that come up when we're giving the good news to people and that sort of thing? And it often doesn't. So that was something that caused me to sort of think, like, should we be doing that as well, and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think that's a good point that you raised there.
Well, and it goes beyond that, Dale, for Bible-oriented evangelicals. If you're not Reformed or Anglican or Catholic or Orthodox, you don't stand up in church and recite, the Athanasian Creed or the Nicene Creed. And really, honestly, the Trinity functionally just doesn't matter in the lives of evangelicals who are Bible-oriented, because it's not in the Bible, right? When you read the Bible, the one true God is the Father and Jesus is somebody else. Maybe he's divine in some sense, but we're kind of afraid to go there most of the time. So yeah, functionally, there are biblical Unitarians like me who just get along in Bible-oriented evangelical churches, and the reason they can sort of do that is most of the time it doesn't come up And most of the time, they don't really even presuppose it in what they're doing and saying.
Gotcha.
The deity of Christ, now that's another thing. That's to them fundamental, and that tends to sort of drive us crazy a little bit. You know, you start off praying to God the Father, and then you thank God for dying for us. You just confuse God and the Son of God. That happens all the time in evangelical churches.
Yeah, and I think it's a fascinating discussion getting into the Bible. But as you said, we can save that for another debate, because that's a topic all in and of itself, kind of thing. But in looking at the Trinity from the philosophical perspective, so I know that you've written the article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, for example, on the Trinity, and I'll include that in the links for the audience. But before we get into discussing my specific model, I take what's called the Trinity Monotheism model. Would you mind maybe taking some time to give us a lay of the land? What are some of the various models that are out there, and what do you make of those?
Yeah. Well, in the field in the last 20 or 30 years, it's become standard to divide approaches to the Trinity into Latin and social approaches, or to Western and Eastern approaches. I don't think that that's terribly helpful, and some patristic scholars have argued that, really, the Westerners and the Easterners are in many cases saying the same things in different language. The way I divide the theories is three self theories, one self theories, and Mysterians. So if you're a Trinitarian, you have to say that there are three, quote, persons in God. And whatever you want to mean by person, I'll let you have that. Let's just say person is a technical term, okay, for Trinitarian theology, and it's just defined how the theory wants to define it. Okay, but I think that all human beings have a concept of a self. The concept of a self is basically a thing, like a lasting, real, substantial object that's the subject of consciousness, and that has will and knowledge and can enter into interpersonal relationships. So human beings we all think, ourselves. Buddhists famously deny that there are any selves, right? That shows they have the concept, though, when they do that. Some Hindus and some Buddhists think there's only one self, which is like the ultimate thing. But anyway, we all have this concept of selves. You could say full-blooded persons if you want. That's kind of means the same thing. Not human persons, but again, just intelligent subject, intelligent agent. So in some Trinity theories, even though we're talking about three, quote, persons, they're really actually understood to just be one self there. And the two most famous theologians in the 20th century, Karl Barth and Karl Rahner, seem to think of the Trinity precisely this way. In fact, both of them suggest that persons, that's misleading. We probably shouldn't talk about persons. Couldn't we replace it with some less misleading term? So what they think the, quote, persons of the Trinity are something like ways God lives, or aspects of God, personae, personalities of God, something like that. But they're just something less than selves. And they really think there's one there. And this is, this fits the Christian practice of always referring to God with singular personal pronouns, right? And the fact that in the Old Testament, God has a personal name, Yahweh, which, seems to assume that he's a single person. And this is probably a majority view with theologically educated Trinitarians in modern times. And one way you can detect it is if people, as soon as they say there are three persons in God, they'll say, oh, but I don't mean persons in the modern sense. And so then what they're saying, I think what they're trying to get at is that they're not selves. They're something less than selves. Okay, but some, especially in recent times, some Trinitarians, have kind of rediscovered the New Testament theme that there's an interpersonal relationship between the Father and the Son in the New Testament. This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. And, Jesus prays to him and trusts in him and so on. So it looks like you have to say the Father and Son are two different selves. And so these are usually I call this a three-self Trinitarian view, but it's more typical to call it social Trinitarianism. And there are these three selves, and most typically, like with Swinburne, all the divine attributes are attributed to each one of these selves. And, indeed, it's part of the old small c Catholic tradition that each one of these is fully divine or has the divine nature. And so, look, if you've got three different things and each one has the divine nature, that just seems the same thing as saying that there are three gods. So it's difficult for a social Trinitarian to make his view come out as truly monotheistic and not also tritheistic. Now, there's a subset of three-self Trinitarians who believe in relative identity theory. They think that the Father and Son can be the same being, but different selves or different persons. And this, on the face of it, is just what you would need to make sense of the Athanasian Creed, although most philosophers think this is very problematic, this doctrine of sortal relative identity. We probably won't talk much more about that, but you can see my encyclopedia article if you want to find out about that, what people like Peter Van Inwagen and Michael Ray think about the Trinity. Okay, but there's another major division. So there's three self people, there's one self people, and then there's people who just are not going to give any content to the doctrine. They're going to say the words, they're going to tell you there aren't any good analogies, and what they really think is there aren't any analogies, and there also isn't any kind of model that you can give for how to understand this language. And so at the bottom of it, you just kind of have this required language, and they don't really have a view about what the persons are, or what to make of the shared divine essence. There are differences about the divine essence as well, right? The creedal claim is that the three are homoousion, that they share one ousia, one essence. Generally, but not always, three self people take that essence to be a universal essence, divinity. A universal property is one that could be simultaneously completely had by different things, different bearers. And then others, typically the one-selfers, think that the ousia, the essence which is shared, is an individual property, analogous to like Dale's instance of humanity. So they think the divinity is a particular property, the kind of property which could only be had by one thing. So it looks like it forces the persons of the Trinity to all be one thing or aspects of one thing. So there are differences about how to understand the divine ousia. There's even suggestion that by a couple of well-known Christian philosophers nowadays that it's analogous to matter. It plays a role similar to the role played by matter in material objects. So it's like stuff, but it's not literally matter. I talk about all these in my little book called What is the Trinity, which is kind of a beginner level sort of introduction to the subject, where I don't even really talk very much about my own views. It's more kind of, so you want to believe in the Trinity? Okay, here's a bunch of options. Let's look at the history where it comes from. Let's ask a few questions about it. That's kind of what that little book does. I got a chapter where I talk about different interpretations of what's meant by the persons in God, and another chapter about different interpretations of this claim that there's one essence there.
Gotcha. Yeah, perfect.
Although
yeah.
Craig doesn't fit into either of the things I just said. I think he thinks that the one essence is not a property, but a being. Aristotle talks about first and second substance, and an example of a first substance is like me or you, like an individual human. And an example of a second substance would be humanity, the property of being human, or the essence that any human has to have. I think Craig thinks that the shared essence is actually a first substance. It's God. It's a concrete individual. It's not a property at all, which is unusual, I think.
I think we'll get into it, but I agree with you on that take. That's the one I sort of opted for as well. That makes the most sense.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Oh, okay. So yeah, I think that gives the audience kind of a lay of the land. Like, what are some of the options here? Let's pretend, hey, I'm up against an expert in this area. Let's pretend Trinity monotheism is totally refuted. There are some other options to look into, and you can see the counters for and against them as well. Maybe one of them works or doesn't. I think with that said, let's get into the topic. Let's assess the Trinity Monotheism model, because that's the one I'm persuaded by, and I think it could work. I think it makes sense of the raw biblical data, where we have these individuals, so they stand in I-thou relations to each other and that sort of thing, as Dale T sort of hinted at, and also we have this clear biblical teaching that there's one God. So how do we make sense of that? So I'll go into sort of my quick opening statement of what is this Trinity monotheism model. So in the first place, so we have three individuals, or in later terminology, quote unquote, persons that are said to be divine, fully divine. And yet we have one thing that is God. So that's in the creedal terms, again, that's one being and three persons. And the way Dr. William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland have tried to make sense of that is with their Trinity monotheism model. So there is only one being, and that is equated to God, Yahweh, the full instantiation of the divine nature proper. So there is only one thing that is God, but the Trinity as a whole is made up of the three persons. So neither God the Father isn't fully God in like an instantiation of the divine nature, neither is God the Son, neither is the Holy Spirit. But together they make up the Trinity, and the Trinity proper is the only thing that you can truly say, well, that is God. And they try to make sense of this. The way to make sense of this is they'll use the Kirbridge Analogy. So look, Cerberus is a three-headed dog in Greek mythology, and it's quote unquote clearly one being. I know Dale will take issue with that, but according to William Lane Craig and that they'll say, look, if there's one dog being there, but there's three individual centers of dog consciousness or dog persons, and you can name them. Rover, Bowser, and Spike is the names they give to it. And let's now, to make it equivalent to the Trinity, let's just say we kill that, so that it's not a physical being, but it's an immaterial being. And that is what the Trinity is. You have these three sets of three persons made up of sets of faculties sufficient for personhood, whatever those faculties are, free will, center of self-consciousness, and that sort of thing, whatever is essential to being a person. And you have three of them, all contained, so to speak, within this one soul that the Bible calls Yahweh, or gives this label of Yahweh. And that's really the model that I think makes the most sense. It does seem to be logically coherent. Using that analogy does help us to envision how this makes sense. And it's important to note that the Trinity itself is not a person. So Yahweh proper is not a person, but it's personal in light of the fact that the three individuals or persons that make it up are persons and that sort of thing. So there is some sort of mereological arrangement, a part-whole relationship, whereby the persons can instantiate certain personal properties, omniscience, omnipotence, and these sort of things. And sometimes the whole can have properties that none of the persons do, like, they'll say the necessity or God's aseity. These are had by the whole. So yeah, I think in a nutshell, that's what the Trinity monotheism model is. William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland, there is an element where some people say that, well, the Son and the Holy Spirit are said to be begotten out of God the Father. So there's some kind of derivation relationship there. And William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland, with their model, just like I tend to do to stay safe, they don't adjudicate on whether that is an aspect. They say no, that they don't think that's true, because that would make the Son or the Holy Spirit of lesser value than God the Father, because it's greater to be unbegotten than begotten. So their model leaves that open, whether you want to believe in some kind of derivation or in how you make sense of that. They don't really specify in their model, though they personally don't believe in that. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers the Trinity monotheism model. Yeah, hopefully anything I missed out there, Dale, that you think I should mention about it?
No, I mean that's that's basically the basics of it. We'll go into more depth about some of the things that he's saying. I think it actually is. It's very clear on the surface, and then when you dig a little bit, it gets really unclear about some things. So. Yeah. But, but before we dig into what I think are problems, I mean, I think there's three kinds of problems with it. There's philosophical problems, there's historical problems, and there's Bible problems. Mm-hmm. And I think they're really pretty bad problems when you pile them all up together. But I think before getting into those, I wanted to say some nice things about Bill Craig's approach to the Trinity, because I think he's right about some important things, and just methodologically, I think there are some really laudable features of his approach. And what I've been told, I think by William Hasker, that in the Craig Moreland book, it was really Craig that wrote the Trinity part. Mm-hmm. So I'll just treat it like it was his. Moreland hasn't said anything about the Trinity since that book came out that I've ever seen, so I'm assuming we're really kind of dealing with one person's theory. Good things. Look, he doesn't just say, hey, this is a mystery and no one's ever going to understand it, and we're just going to say these things. He says in one place that the strength of our approach is that it's not merely formulaic. It tries to actually tell you what this language means. Right. We're not supposed to just repeat the language like parrots. Supposedly these are important truths that we actually have to believe. And so uninterpreted language just won't do. I think he's right about some things about the history, some important things. So he talks in the co-authored book about the Logos theologians of the second and third century, so the late 100s and through the 200s, and well even into the fourth century. And he points out that all of these Logos theorists were subordinationists, that they had a Logos, an eternal son, well, either eternal or at least older than the world. They have a son that's a lesser being than the one God, which is the Father. In fact, I think you could make the point a little bit stronger. It's not just that they're kind of deficient Trinitarians where, the persons aren't equally great, but there's a ranking of the persons, first greatest, second greatest, third greatest. It's not just they're deficient Trinitarians. I would say they're not Trinitarians at all. And the reason why they're not Trinitarians at all is that they think that the one true God is the Father. And when you challenge them on monotheism, what they do is they emphasize the uniqueness of the Father. They don't say, hey, all three of them together are one God. So we're talking about people like Tertullian and Origen, who we have a ton of writing from, and you can really kind of get your head fully around what they think. Lesser writers like Novatian, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Eusebius, the church historian. Yeah, they have a Logos, which is a second God, a lesser God, another God, they say, different in number from the Father. And, well, that's just not Trinitarian at all. There's a greater God, which is the Father, and then there's a lesser God, the Son, and then there's a yet lesser God, which is the Spirit, usually. But he's right that, subordinationism was a part of this central tradition. This was a stepping stone on the way to actually having Trinity theories in the fourth century. I think he's right that generation and procession have no basis in the Bible whatsoever. Like any verse that the patristic authors cited to support generation and procession, it's just wrong. It's just pure eisegesis. They're just reading later interest back into the biblical texts. I think he's right that being fully divine implies existing a se, that is, existing independently of anything else. And so then if the Father were to eternally generate the Son, the Father would be more divine than the Son because he would have a divine attribute that the Son lacks. Aseity is an attribute that just in principle can't be given to another, right? You can't cause somebody else to exist a se, because then if that's an essential feature, then they're existing because of your action. So, and finally, I think he's right that when Scripture and tradition clash, you have to go with Scripture, right? That's the Protestant way. And you can't just give the Trinity a pass just because of its prestige and because reformers like Luther and Calvin basically just kind of rolled things back to the era of Augustine. You have to be willing to even, weigh the precious Nicene Creed against the Bible. And he does that. And in his view, Nicene Trinitarianism is incoherent. So, and it's incoherent because it says that the second and third person are caused eternally to exist by the first, and yet the second and third person are each fully divine. And he thinks that's not true. That's not even possible. So, Trinitarian tradition is funny though, because you can get away with almost anything as long as you say you're a Trinitarian. It absolutely demands lip service, but hey, revising central theses, that will be tolerated. It's really the lip service kind of that functions as the important thing in the tradition. I did a podcast about this once called Trinity Club Orientation, and it talks about this fact. You can find theologians that say all kinds of wild stuff, but as long as they say, hey, I'm Trinitarian, it's all just kind of passed by. So, I mean, he's very boldly revisionary, but he's, by claiming that title, he's keeping himself within the mainstream. Of course, not all Trinitarians are going to agree with that.
Yeah, that's something I definitely agree with you on, that these matters are, especially if you believe, like I do, that an essential doctrine, at the very least, to admit Jesus' deity. These things are important. A lot of times Christians don't want to even. There's this worry that if they even try to look into it, they'll get a wrong opinion and they'll be damned as a result. So there is this fear, I guess, that some people have to even start considering it, and I sort of see that as a lack of faith. I mean, God, get in there, trust in God to help you and to guide you into the truth. And you might as well just say, why not throw out the Bible? Don't read the Bible. You might learn something that could come to a wrong conclusion or something like that. But no, we need to roll up our sleeves and be willing to get in there, and let's try our best to figure out what the truth is on this important and or even essential issue.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And the fear element, it's hard baked into the tradition. The system has always depended on most people being afraid to really look into it. This required language was foisted on the church by the bishops assembled by a Roman emperor in the year 381. And when it was foisted on the church, they didn't know what it meant necessarily, and we're still trying to figure that out. And there's always been an elite which will tell you, and this is true of Catholics and Protestants and Orthodox, there's always been an elite that tells you, hey, this is beyond you. This is something that you shouldn't meddle in. It's too dangerous. And now people like us, we get to talk about it at great length because I'm not sure exactly why. We're holier, we're more knowledgeable, maybe both. But yeah, when people start looking into it themselves, that's when further Reformation breaks out. This has been happening over and over since the Reformation. Shortly after Luther, Catholic people who are looking into the Bible and trying to see, how much of Catholic tradition was there, they started discovering, oh wait, this triune God stuff isn't there. And so there's a long early modern history of this that I've spent hundreds of hours reading. But anyway, back to Craig. Where were we?
Oh, you're asking me. So yeah, you listed the three things that you think are good about Craig's model or attempt to make sense of the doctrine of the Trinity.
Yeah, he's actually thinking. He's considering actual substantial issues. He's just not being impressed by its prestige, just kind of hand-waving appeals to mystery. He realizes that a lot of mystery appeals are just intellectual laziness and just refusal to look into it. And, if it's an impenetrable mystery, that's convenient for a lot of people. That means I get to talk about it because I'm an expert on this, and you just have to listen and not ask me hard questions. There's a genre of what I call cheerleading books about the Trinity. Fred Sanders is the perfect example of this. The Trinity's awesome. It's wonderful. It's whatever it is. Like, you never kind of get clear whatever it is. It's the heart of the gospel. There's all this sloganeering about it and just puffery and all this lament that it's not the center of everything Christians do. But then there's not like serious investigation of kind of what it means, why believe it, how is it implied by the Bible. It's actually very hard to get it out of the Bible. Whereas I used to think it was easy. Now I think it's very hard. I gave a presentation of this about a year ago called How to Prove That the Bible Is Trinitarian. This is a podcast episode. And it's a lot harder than just the Father's God, the Son's God, the Spirit's God, and there's only one God. That doesn't get you the creedal doctrine. What I just said is compatible with subordinationist Unitarian views and with oneness type theologies. To get a creedal Trinitarian view, you have to add in some things that are actually very hard to get from Scripture, such as that the Father and Son share one ousia. But let me go back to my point that Craig is heavily revisionary. He's really kind of going straight against Catholic traditions in a sense, and Brian Leftow points this out in his discussion somewhere, or maybe it's Daniel Howard Snyder, I forget which, maybe both of them. The Catholic tradition is that the three persons of the Trinity share the divine essence. And what's meant there is that each of them is divine in the way that the one God is divine. So you could say fully divine is one way we paraphrase this nowadays. Craig's view is that none of the persons is divine in the way that the one God is divine. Right, so it's not all of them, it's none of them. Now, this prevents them from being unequal, right? But it's just not what the tradition says. He has the idea, well, look, the Trinity is the only God. Right, that's what a Trinitarian is supposed to say. But, when you actually read the Cappadocian Fathers and Augustine and so on, no, they really think there are these three hypostases, three individuals, three things, three persons that have the divine essence, and that entails being a God. So it's divine nature, divine essence in the sense where that entails being a God. It's just they think they're the same God. So Craig just has none of them being a God. They're all parts of God. They're divine in the sense that they're parts of God. He tends to downplay this talk of parts in the theory. And he says, he doesn't want to commit to any theory of parts. That's fine. But, he's well aware that a lot of Trinitarians are in favor of divine simplicity, and that rules out God having any parts of any kind or even multiple properties. But yeah, the idea that the persons are just parts of God, they're divine in precisely that sense. I mean, for most of the history of Trinitarian theology, that would just be treated as like an obvious mistake. Like they're not supposed to be 1/3 of God. They're all supposed to be God.
It raises the issue of partialism, possibly.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a deeper problem regarding small c Catholic tradition and Craig. I mean, Craig is the first person to ever hold this view. It's not conservative or traditional to say that the correct theology of God came about in the late 20th century. That God through his providence, foisted this difficult language on the church. And then finally, thanks be to God, this guy figured it out in the late 20th century. Like, that's kind of absurd. But if you can't point to earlier people who held this, yeah, I mean, it's the opposite of traditional and conservative. It's bold. I'll give him points for that. It's aiming at truth. I'll give him points for that. But it's really a very poor fit, I think, with Catholic tradition. And I think it does make some basic moves to overcome some basic problems. So people interested in apologetics, I've seen be interested in this, but like theologians and analytic theologians, I'm not aware of any that are sympathetic to Craig's theology. It's too idiosyncratic to them, and they see some of the problems with it.
Okay, all right. Well, just before we move on to kind of the, pressing these, and let's probe a little bit deeper into the model. What are some of these problems, and we can have back and forth on that. But before we get into the probing section, where I probe you on asking you some questions, and then we'll spend the bulk of the show of you sort of leading the discussion by probing me. But is there anything else by way of an introductory general statement about the Trinity Monotheism that you'd like to mention, or do you think in terms of introduction you've covered it all?
Well, I mean, I've only covered problems having to do with history. There's still philosophy and Bible.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I mean, just take the Bible, and then we'll go more to philosophy. So it's a central and clear New Testament teaching that the one God is the Father, that the Father is the only true God. And being Trinitarian, this model is inconsistent with that. It makes the Father one of three parts of God. Divine in the way a part of God can be divine. But that's not the same thing as being the one true God himself, which I would argue is presupposed in every New Testament book. Another bizarre thing about his view on the level of the Bible is, the God of the Bible is a self. You got the whole Old Testament where God is speaking through prophets, and, there's no one like me. I am he. I'm the only God. I'm in charge of history. I'm able to predict the future because I'm provident over history, right? I, me, my, he, all singular personal pronouns. There's a few anomalies, which we can talk about if you want, but, people have visions of God, and it's like a guy on a throne, right? The whole Old Testament and New Testament impression of God is of a single person, a single self, right? It's our Father in heaven. And his God isn't a person, right? His answer is, well, that's okay because God is personal. What he means is that it has parts which are persons, right? But so does a soccer team. A soccer team is not a person. So does a family. A family is not a person. When Craig, is thinking like an evangelical, he treats God as a person. God is always a he. The second Trinity theory comes up. Now God is a that which, because he knows you're not supposed to say that the Trinity is a he, because that would make a fourth person, and you're only supposed to have three, right? But as soon as we're out of the context of this, he thinks about God like a Unitarian. He prayer is primarily, he says in his Sunday school lectures, prayer is primarily to the Father through the Son in the Spirit. Great, that's what I think. Where's the prayer to the Trinity? That's what you would expect if the Trinity is the one true God. Okay, so look, even just by definition, a God seems to be a self, right? A God is supposed to be this all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly morally good being, and those properties seem to entail being a self. But his God isn't one. His God is this thing which somehow underlies or supports three selves, which are those things that I just said. So there's a real poor fit here with the Bible and with just evangelical and wider Christian tradition. I mean, here's a different way to put it. In the Bible, by definition, God is a God. This guy we call God, this character that we call God, is a God. He's the only God. Or if you go to an earlier usage of God terms, like in the Old Testament, he's the greatest of the gods, of the Elohim. But anyway, God is by definition a God. He's the only God. This thing that Craig calls God is not a God, which is just seems like it's wrong on the level of the Bible. Yeah, so philosophical problems. Oh boy.
And just so the audience know, so I'm letting Dale as the guest mention, give you a sense of his view on the historical and Bible problems, but I'm not responding to those directly, because what we're doing is we're going to be focusing on the philosophical problems in this show to discuss that. But I will put up links that are biblical debates between Dale Tuggy versus Michael L. Brown, and also your debate with Chris Date. I thought were really good. So, yeah, if you're interested in hearing back and forth on the Bible and a bit on the history issue, I'll send links to those debates for people.
Yeah, there's a book version of the Date debate now too, which I think goes into a lot more depth about certain issues, including early patristic history and patristic theology. But
what the sorry, do you mind? What's the title of that book, if you know offhand?
The title is Jesus Human and Not Divine? ? A debate. And it's co-authored by me and Chris Date.
Perfect. Okay, yeah. So go ahead, finish your introductory statement there.
Yeah, the whole thing bristles with philosophical problems. These come out more when Craig gives a couple of brusque, short answers to Daniel Howard Snyder's critique in a couple of short later pieces that he wrote. One point is that Cerberus is totally unhelpful for his position. That analogy is just wrong. If there was a creature like that, we wouldn't think it was a three-headed dog. We would think it was three dogs with overlapping bodies. And you can see this just by considering the case which Howard Snyder brings up of conjoined twins. A couple of years ago in the news, there were a lot of news stories about these sisters. And if you just saw them walking down the street, it kind of looks like one body with one head in the normal position and one head kind of shooting off to the side. And they were conjoined twins, what used to be called Siamese twins. And but their bodies so strongly overlap that it almost looks like one normal body. Nobody calls that a two-headed girl. Everybody knows that the parents have two daughters. They're two different girls there, and it's just that their bodies overlap. If we could separate them, we would, if we could do it at low risk, but we can't in that case. So this is not an example of one living thing that has three, quote, centers of consciousness. It's an example of three dogs that are unfortunately, their bodies are stuck together, basically, and overlap one another. But that's totally unhelpful, right? You don't want to say the Trinity is three gods that somehow can't be separated from one another. His new talk about centers of consciousness is really opaque and unclear. And I think I understand why he talks about centers of consciousness. It's because he's ambivalent about whether the persons should count as substances, or that is primary substances, because he wants to say the only substance there is God. But sometimes he seems to treat them as selves, and yet he says they just somehow result from faculties, which is very mysterious. That's another point, right? So he says, your soul is one person. You're one person because your soul only has one set of intellectual faculties, right? Mm-hmm. He says, well, God is three persons because God has three sets of faculties. If you have intellectual faculties, that makes the owner of the faculties a person. Okay, so if there's a soul which can think in three different ways, and so it has three sets of faculties, that's just one person that can think in three ways. It's overdetermined. Or even if you took away one faculty, the two remaining ones would still make it a person. So I don't see how you get three persons out of that. It's only one soul that is the owner. If that owner has those faculties, then that's an intelligent thing. That's a self, an agent, a person. So that's just it's dark and obscure, and he seems to think that the persons, whatever they are, just kind of supervene on the faculties themselves, and so that's why each one of them doesn't make God a person, but they're these three persons in God. But that's a wholly obscure claim, I would say. Another thing which maybe we'll save for later as we get more into the details after you push back is he divides the divine attributes up in a bizarre way between the Trinity and the persons. And that's unprecedented. That just doesn't happen in Christian tradition. And the motivation for it is something that he doesn't explain, but I think I kind of understand why he does it. And Howard Snyder effectively pushes him on this. So we'll have to talk about this division of divine attributes and this idea of property borrowing that his model requires.
All right, cool. So I think that covers it in terms of the opening statements. It gives the audience sort of a sense of, okay, in general, what is this model? And in general, what are some of the philosophical issues that we'll be focusing on? As well, additionally, Dale mentioned some issues that could be in the Bible and history as well that won't be covered in this show, unless Dale wants me to address that. But all right, cool. So I think what we'll do is we'll go to the probing stage, and I want to sort of just probe you a little bit, just to get sort of a bearings on your positions that might be helpful for later on when we're assessing Trinity Monotheism. So in the first place, I just wanted to ask you, so you kind of hinted in terms of, okay, so number one, you're a Unitarian, and a Unitarian concept of beings or people, of course, that's logically coherent by default. Human beings are an example of it. We have proof that, you win. That's a coherent concept. But I just want to sort of get an idea from you as to what exactly that might entail. So, okay, so you mentioned there are two forms of two types of substances. Did you want to just maybe what is the difference again for the audience between primary and a secondary substance?
Well, again, this is just standard lingo that goes back to Aristotle. A first substance or primary ousia is supposed to be an individual thing, like a bearer of properties that last through time. So it's a concrete object, such as a person or a tree, maybe a planet. And a second substance or second ousia is supposed to be like an essence, the features which define a certain type of thing. Philosophers call this a natural kind nowadays. So, in old philosophy, they would say that the essence of humanity is rational animal. That seems a little too general, but it's whatever it is, it's whatever features it is that makes something an example of a human being. So it's all the properties which are necessary and sufficient for being a human. And so theology has always talked about the divine essence in this way. And so, for instance, most Christians think it's essential to God to be all-knowing and all-powerful and perfectly good. And so you couldn't be God and not have those features. It's part of what it is to be God. It's entailed by divinity.
And substance is equated to being, just so the audience can know.
Well, being can mean either one of those. I mean, being, and it can also mean something like matter. So, I mean, being is just a vague term as is substance or essence.
Gotcha. Okay. So what, in your view, then, what does it mean to be a person?
I think this is a concept that's built into all human beings. That we all understand ourselves to be persons, and we understand others to be persons or selves. And also, if you believe in any God, you think God is a self. So it's a subject of consciousness, something that has a first person point of view, something that can intentionally act. So it can act for a reason. So it has to have some degree of intelligence and will. And I think to be a full-blown person, you have to be capable of entering into interpersonal relationships where you communicate with others, trust in others, join together in common projects with others. So the concept of a self, any human is supposed to be a self. Any God is supposed to be a self. other mythological creatures like fairies and leprechauns and nagas and all kinds of things. They're thought of as selves, right? You could talk to them, you could reason with them, you could negotiate with them. Anything that you can do that with is a self. So it's basically the concept of an intelligent agent.
And so, on your view, because I know it's relevant to an objection you raised, you know, where and you kind of hinted at it in this thing, where you're saying, like, well, if a person is just a set of faculties, well, faculties don't know things. They're not a center of self-consciousness or that.
Mm-hmm.
So, on your view, is it the soul? Is it the substance, the soul itself that's the knower? That's the thing that's knowing.
Right. A faculty, that concept is just the concept of a general power, like a general set of capabilities. You know, I have the faculty of locomotion. I have the faculty of speaking English. I have the faculty of thinking about philosophy. So faculty is just like a general power. And you're right. It's not the faculty that acts. It's the thing with the faculty that acts. What you're going to say about that depends on your philosophical anthropology. And honestly, I don't think Christians have to take one view. Most Christians are dualists, and they would say that it's either the soul, which is the subject of consciousness, or it's the soul plus the body together. That's one unit that's the subject of consciousness. And then some Christians are physicalists and about humans, and they think that just the living organism or the brain, or some physical object, which is, you know, where I am, they think that's the thinker, right? But none of them think that it's the faculty that you know enters into interpersonal relationships or intelligently acts or thinks. The faculty is the power that enables you to do various things.
So yeah, I think this will just be my last thing to ask you about. So I wanted to get your take. Okay, so we understand.
But can I add one more thing about that?
Yeah, sure.
I don't think a person might think this when first encountering Craig's view, but he doesn't think that the persons are faculties.
Mm-hmm.
He thinks that somehow necessarily the persons exist because each person exists because of this faculty, which is, again, a very mysterious claim, I think. But right, because normally we think a faculty of having a mind would be part of what makes the owner of that faculty a person. But that's not what he's saying. Okay, so he denies that this soul, which is God, is a person, which again is weird, right? Most believers in souls by definitions are persons. At least that's the classical kind of Cartesian view, and arguably Platonic dualism as well. But that's not what he thinks, because he knows you're not supposed to say that the triune God is a person.
Yeah, that's you kind of got where I was sort of where I'm sort of probing if it's necessarily the case that a person is equated to a substance and that sort of thing. And yeah, I'm sure we'll get into that. All right, cool.
Well, I think it is because a person is the sort of thing which lasts one and the same throughout time, and which a person is the sort of thing which has various features, and that's just what a substance is in metaphysics, like a first substance, an individual entity, a concrete entity. So yeah, I think a self is by definition a substance. That's part of the concept. And I don't know if Craig thinks they're substances or not. I think he chooses this dark term center of consciousness precisely because it's vague. It kind of suggests that it's a person and a substance, but then maybe it's something less.
All right, cool. All right, so yeah, the last area that I wanted to sort of probe you on is well let's look. So that's great when it comes to a human being. I can kind of get behind what you're saying and how that makes sense in terms of the concepts there. But when it comes to God, who is the only maximal great being, perhaps this idea that God is just one self isn't logically coherent. There are arguments, you've alluded to a couple in your work, but like Richard Swinburne's argument that God, in order to actualize love, there has to be three individuals. Why three? Well, there has to be at least another individual for you to love, to enact love. as an actualized thing as opposed to just a potentiality. Well, why three? Because, well, if it's to be selfless love, there needs to be a third individual for the second person you love to love, and that third person loves them without you needing to be involved at all. So why not four? Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is the most likely, and three is the least amount of persons needed to an actualized love. And the sort of thing that I wanted to raise with you there is I don't buy this argument myself, and I know you don't. But the thing with you is I've seen in your other work you do seem to hint, and this kind of gets into the incarnation a little bit, but that you take issue with the fact that, hey, when Jesus was on earth during his time of humiliation, he wasn't actively omnipotent. He wasn't consciously omniscient. You know, that William Lane Craig has this notion that they were subliminal or sublimated during his time as a human being in some way. And I'm wondering if you're going to argue that, well, no, in order to be divine in any sense, you have to be actively omniscient and consciously omniscient and that sort of thing. Why can't the Christians say, well, in order for God to be a maximal great being, there has to be this active love? You can't just exist as a potential or something.
I'm not sure I understand how you're tying this in with omniscience, but let's talk. You can press that again after I describe Craig's view. So the full argument that you gave was the Swinburne argument, where he basically claims that if there's one divine person, there have to then in eternity also be exactly three divine persons. So he thinks there can't only be one, and then he tries to show that this has to stop once you get to three. Yeah, most people don't accept that argument. Most Christian philosophers that are Trinitarians don't accept that argument. In particular, they don't see how you stop it, because if it's so wonderful to produce another divine person, wouldn't it be even more wonderful to just keep on going? In Craig's hands, I think when I remember, he sets aside that second step of the argument. For Craig, it's basically an anti-Unitarian argument. And he thinks that the idea of a single person God is incoherent. And partly he likes this as a stick to beat the Muslims with. But it would work against Jews and against Unitarian Christians like me and against oneness people if it were a convincing argument. So basically, it's the idea that it's logically impossible for there to be a single divine person. And the reason is because that you have to say that God is perfectly loving, and a single divine person wouldn't be perfectly loving unless there was another divine person for him to love. Okay. I think this, I've talked about this in several podcasts. In the most recent one where I'm actually interacting with Swinburne at a conference, I also discussed Craig's version, and I think Craig's version is very poor, because it just depends on this equivocation between perfectly loving as an action and perfectly loving as an attribute, like a character trait. And so I agree that to be fully divine, you have to be perfectly loving. That's part of moral perfection, to be a perfectly loving being. Also to be perfectly merciful, perfectly forgiving. It's a character trait, yeah. So whoever's fully divine has to have that. But this doesn't entail actually loving somebody else, right? It's a character trait. So I think the argument just trades on that equivocation. A perfect being has to be perfectly loving in the sense of having that as a character trait, but there's no reason to think that a perfect being has to actually be, enjoying the best kind of love or something like that. There's no reason to think that God, would be lonely unless he had somebody else or something like that. It's just God's not a social animal like human beings are, right? If you take me or you and put us in lockdown, in solitary confinement, we won't flourish, we won't thrive, we'll kind of waste away. But there's no reason to think that God is built that way, right? Christians think that God didn't need to create, and so then it's possible that God should just exist alone. But the idea is that he's just blessed and kind of well off just on his own resources. So now if you say, well, isn't it better to be actually loving than not? Yeah, I think it's a great thing to enjoy love. I think it's very important, but you don't want to start saying that God has to have all great goods, all important goods, right? Because then it's going to be necessary that God creates. Because here's a great and wonderful good, being the God over a marvelous cosmos like the one that exists. But it's not like God needs it, right? Even though it's a great thing, it's better to have that than not. The idea is it's plausible to think that a perfect being shouldn't need anything outside of himself to thrive.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. Like it's sort of what I was trying to do with the compare and contrast there is, look, there's this notion that it's greater to actualize certain goods versus just leave them as potentials, right? Like God existing alone. Creation is, I see it on sort of equal total utilities, right? So a possible world where God exists alone is of equal, quote unquote, overall utility to the actual world where God chooses to create, because otherwise it would be if there was a lesser utility, it would be necessary God not create. If there is a greater utility, then it would be necessary that God has to create. Creation would be necessary. But the major point that I'm getting at is love doesn't have to be actualized in order, like actualized love is not greater than potential love. And that's what I was sort of bringing up with the omniscience as sort of a comparison thing where you've kind of argued, well, look, actual omniscience, like a conscious omniscience where Jesus actually knows everything, and is greater than subconscious omniscience or something. I don't really buy that argument. That would fail for the same reason that this Swinburne's argument using love would fail to prove the Trinity. And I was just trying to use that as sort of a compare and contrast. Does that make more sense? Like actual love, yeah.
Yeah, well, you have to, I think there's a difference between talking about the greatness of a being, and the tradition is you think that the greatness of a being supervenes on the essential properties of that being. Then you can talk about the greatness of a circumstance or a state of affairs or an event. I mean, if I have to pick between having no friends and having friends, I'm going to pick having friends. But when we're talking about the greatness of a being, it looks like we stick with essential characteristics. At least that's the tradition of perfect being theology. About Jesus supposedly being omniscient, but this is subconscious. I mean, the problem with this is he tells us he doesn't know the day or the hour, so he would be lying to us, or he would know that he knows it because he knows everything. So then it looks like he'd be intentionally lying to us when he tells us he doesn't know the day and the hour, and that's not acceptable to me.
Gotcha. So it's sort of like a Bible thing. Like we would have to be reading in that what Jesus is really saying, that he subconsciously knows, but he doesn't consciously know, or something like that. And you think that's
and of course it goes beyond one verse, because he's going around asking people questions and very, very much acting like he has limited knowledge, although he does have some supernatural knowledge that couldn't normally be had, like when he sees, what is it, Nathaniel praying under a tree. But I mean, the New Testament Jesus doesn't seem to know everything, and that's why, for instance, he can pray in Gethsemane that he should be spared. You couldn't do that if you knew with certainty exactly what was going to happen. My views are based on kind of trying to take the whole New Testament and trying to focus on the clear verses. I know all the verses that are normally appealed to try to prove, that he's fully divine and so on. I just don't think that. I think in every case there's a well-motivated first century reading which doesn't imply or assume that.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask that. So thank you for giving that, because it does relate to the Swinburne type argument for the Trinity in that. So yeah, I just wanted to get your take. So sorry for kind of going into the incarnation.
Well, one more thing about the Swinburne move, which again, yeah, Craig does like the first part of. He thinks he can show that a single person God is impossible because it wouldn't be the greatest possible being, because it wouldn't be perfectly loving. just historically, it puts you in a bizarre position, because the first person who made an argument like this was Richard of St. Victor in the High Middle Ages. And if this was such an obvious thing, somebody would have thought of it before. Now, some popular preachers will say that this is an Augustine. In fact, Swinburne says it's an Augustine, but it's not. I talk about this in my podcast episode where I'm interacting with Swinburne. I think it's called The Failure of Popular Anti-Unitarian Arguments. I discussed this passage in Augustine. It's not about God being tripersonal. It's about eternal generation. But yeah, look, this would be news to the Jews, and honestly, it'd be news to the authors of the New Testament that suddenly this idea of a single person, which is God, is actually incoherent. This is the only God you see in the New Testament. Is whenever the one true God comes up, the one God, the only God, the Almighty, that's the Father.
So yeah, I said that was the last question. I did have a question for you. When I thought we were going to be doing the Bible and the history thing, and you do seem to be hinting at this argument from lack of pedigree. So just maybe I'll just ask this then to get your take on. For Christians, you definitely believe, as a Bible believer, that God does use progressive revelation. He doesn't
Yes.
have to reveal everything at once. So
Yes.
okay, so maybe as a question for you, why is it so bad? Let's pretend Craig, he's the first one who's come up with this Trinity Monotheism thing. That doesn't necessarily in and of itself mean that, oh well, it has to be false because no one else thought of it before, or like why is this argument from pedigree important for you, if you get what I'm saying?
Well, part of my point is, if someone comes along and say, oh, here's an obvious implication of this widely believed thing, and then hundreds of years nobody makes this inference, well, that's strong evidence that it's just not an obvious implication at all.
Yeah.
So it's reasoning that way. Pedigree, look, if you're a Protestant, then you think that divine revelation occurred in the apostolic age, and that this resulted in the faith once delivered to the saints. And this is why we can roll back the papacy, transubstantiation, devotion to Mary, etc., etc. Those things weren't endorsed in these sources. In fact, it's assumed that you wouldn't do these things, that they'd be inappropriate. So Protestants should not think that divine progressive revelation stretches up through, the ecumenical councils. You shouldn't think that God is now revealing new things in the year 381 at Constantinople at the Second Ecumenical Council. How is that being a Protestant? The Protestant view is that it's packed into the Bible. Now, Catholics and Orthodox have an advantage here. When they look at the Bible, and if you point out to Roman Catholic scholars that the Trinity is not in the Bible, a lot of times they'll say, that's right, so what? We don't think it's in the Bible. We believe it because it's taught by the one true church, and it was taught later. So Protestants ideologically, Protestants have to find all of what they think are essential claims. They have to be in the Bible. Otherwise you wouldn't believe them, right? We're Protestants.
Yeah.
And so they have to squeeze the text as hard as they can to try to get Trinity out of them. And, it just doesn't work. I wanted to, when you proposed having me on to talk about Craig, I'm like, great, let's do that. There's a lot to talk about there. I don't mean to preclude talking about the Bible. It's just that is kind of a whole conversation in itself.
Gotcha. Fair enough.
Because I understand that people like Craig are looking at the whole Bible and they're saying, well, look, if you piece these things together, then actually the Trinity is implied or assumed there. It's just maybe Christians didn't have enough language to kind of express this comfortably, and it took centuries of debate, and finally they figured out kind of what they wanted to say. But so Christians are kind of, in a way, confused Trinitarians all along, or Trinitarians who can't express their view well, and then thanks be to God, the right language is brought about by these councils and these bishops.
Okay.
I understand that that's their view. I just think it's false. So there isn't anybody before the second half of the 300s. If you don't count modalistic monarchians, nobody is talking about a triune God until the second half of the 300s. The earliest example I've seen is from around the year 360. But really, it only becomes widespread in the time of the Cappadocians and Augustine, so 370s, 380s. But before that, there's God. That's the Father. That's in all the old creeds. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, creator of the heavens and the earth. But God has also brought about, either before creation or eternally, this divine logos, which they think is the divine element in Jesus. And then there's a Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit's still heavily disputed in the year 380. We know this because Gregory of Nazianzus tells us this. It wasn't really focused on, and so there were still lots of different views in play at that time. And it's just a more obscure topic, I guess, in Scripture than the doctrine of God and the Son of God.
Yeah.
But so I'm familiar with what I call the Catholic narrative, that Christians were always kind of implicitly Trinitarian. They figured out how Trinitarian they were later. I think that's just false. I talk about this in a couple of podcast interviews on the One God Report podcast. But to just sum it up in like one little paragraph, you have the New Testament view, which I claim is my view. But even before the turn of the century, before the year 100, people start to speculate about pre-existence for Jesus. And then starting in the middle of the 100s, you have Logos theories come in. And then you have people reacting against the Logos theories. That's the dynamic monarchians and the modalistic monarchians. Dynamic monarchians are basically people who have my sort of view. Modalistic monarchians are like akin to oneness people. And then you had those two dueling streams in mainstream theology all through the 200s and deep into the 300s. Basically the dispute was, the Arius dispute was ended when the Roman emperor decided that the pro-Nicene side was correct, and he ruled in their favor, and that was it. You're not Christian if you're not on their side.
Yeah.
And so that's precisely when you can date the first Trinitarian creed. And I argue this in my book, What is the Trinity? I think the 381 creed is implicitly Trinitarian. It's not very clear and explicit, but if you understand it in context, then I claim that it does presuppose a triune God. But the 325 creed doesn't. No earlier creed does, because there weren't any Trinitarians then.
Fair enough. Yeah, and you're right. That is sort of off topic, but I did want to just get your sense on progressive understanding of not even so much revelation, but we progress in our knowledge of truths in general, and that. So. But yeah, let's go back to what you want to focus on, because you're the guy.
So yeah, progressive revelation I'm totally in favor of. I mean, if you believe in the Old Testament and the New Testament, you have to believe in progressive revelation, right? Mm-hmm. And not only that, but you have to believe that God sort of encoded another message into the Old Testament, verses which later would be understood to also have to do with Christ. And so you see this in the New Testament use of the Old Testament. But I don't think that as Christians we're authorized to do that with the New Testament. We can't take 4th century ideas and say, aha, these 4th century ideas are the key to understanding these 1st century sources. It's just anachronistic misreadings. There's nothing encoded there. It's not dark prophecies. The New Testament books, are trying to be clear. They're trying to proclaim their message openly. It's not waiting to be uncovered by scholars later on.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for indulging that question for me there. So, yeah, at this point, I want to make sure we spend the most of the time on what you want to focus on. So I'm actually going to hand over the reins to you, based on you gave about 3 objections to Trinity, philosophical objections to Trinity monotheism. So, yeah, I'll turn the reins to you, and you can sort of probe me, ask me questions that can spark kind of a back and forth dialogue, or that you want to get my take on.
Well, why aren't you, if you're not, why aren't you worried about the way that Craig divides the divine attributes up between the Trinity and the persons? Because to me, that's unprecedented. And the motivation is, I understand it, but it's weird. And I think the division doesn't work in some cases. So I don't know if you have a list of them in front of you. I have a list from a book chapter from a book that maybe someday I'll finish writing that's on Craig's theory. But so he notices that some of the traditional divine attributes entail being a person. Mm-hmm. So being omniscient, that's to have perfect knowledge, right? Having knowledge involves having a first person point of view, right?
Yep.
Being omnipotent, that means you have the greatest kind of power, and that's the power to intentionally act. So to act for a reason with some aim in mind, that's something that only a self can do. Like an electron doesn't intentionally act, or a mountain or a dirt clod doesn't intentionally act, right? Only conscious subject does that with knowledge. Perfectly good, right? That's a moral. That's about your moral qualities. Basically, you have perfect character. And you have to be a person to be morally perfect, right? Like a stereo speaker, it can't sin, but it can't be morally perfect. Or your left foot, it's just not the sort of thing that could have moral perfections like honesty, trustworthiness, sympathy, other good virtues like that, right? So he notices that these divine attributes entail being a person, and so he says, okay, well then it's the persons of the Trinity that have them in the strict sense, but then the Trinity has them derivatively. Okay, but how do you have, and Daniel Howard Snyder presses him on this point. I don't think he ever answers it. To have a feature derivatively, to have a feature, you have to be the kind of thing that can have that feature. So the Trinity is not a self by definition for Craig. Mm-hmm. So it just can't be all-knowing, all-powerful, and perfectly good. So what does it even mean to say that it's had derivatively? I understand this kind of thing when it comes to predicates, but not with properties. So property is supposed to be kind of an element or an aspect of a thing's reality, you know, that involves its being a certain way. So it's supposed to be, you know, your intelligence is supposed to be an attribute of you. You know, your intention to eat lunch later is an attribute of you. Not an essential attribute, but an attribute. But then there are predicates. Those are just linguistic items that we will say. So say you have a soccer team, okay? Mm-hmm. And one guy on the team is really fast. One guy has good hands, and one guy is a great kicker, okay? Mm-hmm. So you might say that the whole team has good hands, or the whole team kicks well, or something like that, just because one of its parts does. Mm-hmm. I understand that. You know, you say that I'm injured when just my foot is injured, okay? Mm-hmm. But it's not literally true that the team is a good kicker. It's not the kind of thing that kicks. It can't be a kicker. Teams don't kick. Teams don't even have hands. They can't have good hands. So yeah, we do sort of smear around descriptions between parts and wholes sometimes. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we'll call a property of the whole a property of a part, and vice versa. But he doesn't put it that way. He doesn't put it in terms of descriptions. He puts it in terms of properties. And that just, to me, that just doesn't work.
Okay. Yeah. So I do see it in terms of properties as well. I'm not sure I see the issue that you're getting at, or the problem. So William Lane Craig, in his article, and I'll send links to the Daniel Howard Snyder as well as William Lane Craig's response for the audience. But William Lane Craig, for example, gives a chart where he deals with certain mereological. So mereology is just the study of parts and wholes and their relations. So I think the example you give would be more akin to like a collection of individuals, like a pack of wolves or a team of soccer players and that sort of thing. And I guess on that level, what you're saying does make sense in terms of, well, the soccer player has this property of being able to kick hard. Does it make sense to say that collection has that property in light of that? Like, does the team have the property of being able to kick hard? And I guess that makes sense on a predicate level, on a language level, but maybe it doesn't make sense technically in terms of ascribing that property to the team. But so the answer is William Lane Craig sees the thing as an individual. So it's the type of thing that it is, perhaps. Like the team is not a substance in itself. It's I don't know, a property thing. What I don't know what you would call it. The team's a collection. So yeah, God is one soul with three persons. So it's an individual being or individual soul in relation to multiple individuals, and that's different than the team, which is a collection of individuals.
Yeah, I mean, he does seem to commit to the Trinity being a not just a mere collection of things, but a thing in its own right. So a complex thing, a thing with components or parts. But that, look, sometimes you can transfer features of a part to a whole, and sometimes you can't. You know, if you can't say the whole pie is pointy just because every piece of the pie is pointy. But you can say that the whole pie has mass because each portion of the pie has mass. Each piece of the pie has mass. So it just depends on the property. But Howard Snyder's point is, if it's a property which in principle can't be had by that sort of thing, it's no good to point out that the part has it, right?
Yeah.
Because again, to be all-knowing, you have to be a self. And he doesn't think the Trinity, or just put it even more generally, to be all-knowing, you have to have a first-person point of view. And he doesn't think the Trinity has that, but he thinks the persons do. Right. As I understand him, he thinks that the Trinity as a whole is the greatest conceivable being. Yeah. But this is traditionally understood as requiring those three qualities I talked about, being perfect in knowledge, power, and goodness. But if it's not a self, it doesn't have moral goodness. It doesn't have intentional power. It doesn't have knowledge. So what he wants to say is, well, but the Trinity has knowledge. It's a whole that gets that property from its parts. But it's not the kind of thing that in principle could have that sort of property. So I think what he's doing is he doesn't want to say that he knows he has to say there are two different senses in which the Trinity is divine and in which the persons are divine, right? And he doesn't want to say that one of those senses is merely honorific, like that you're just saying it's a God but not properly so called, or you're saying it's a God because it's closely related to a God somehow. He doesn't want to say that. So what he does is he's dividing up the attributes. He's giving the self-implying ones, well, at least most of them, to the persons, and he's trying to give the rest of them, such as necessary existence, eternal existence, to the Trinity. Although, again, it doesn't work, right? He says, in one place, I think he says the Trinity is the only being worthy of worship.
Yes.
Okay, but worship is an I-thou kind of relation. It's offered to a self from another self. If it's not a self, you can talk up and honor something that's not a self, but you don't, properly speaking, worship it. But his view must be that the Trinity counts as being worshipped because it has parts that are worshipped, namely the Father, Son, and Spirit. Yeah, but it doesn't seem to be an appropriate object of worship, right? Any object of worship is a he, or in principle a she. That's right. So you know, for instance, Buddhists, the type of Buddhists, which this isn't most Asian Buddhists, but the type of Buddhist who doesn't believe in any deities at all, or any Buddhas as real beings, but they think that there's some impersonal ultimate, right? For a person like that, their religion just doesn't involve worship. It's totally not devotional, you could say. Because there's nothing that's an appropriate object. The Buddha nature, or the one true mind, or whatever their ultimate is supposed to be, the truth body of the Buddha, that's not the kind of thing it makes sense to worship, and so that's why they don't. Most Buddhists worship scads of beings, but that's another conversation. So yeah, I think he's dividing up the attributes so that he can say that each one of these, the whole and the parts, have some important divine attributes. But it's a really weird move because none of them has all the divine attributes. And he tries to solve that by saying, well, they borrow it from the other one, but then it doesn't seem to work in a lot of cases, namely the Trinity borrowing features that only a self in principle can have.
Yeah, so I think this is a great point, especially in light of when you mention the ontological argument, because this argues for a maximal great being. It's arguing for the Trinity itself. And technically speaking, we define maximal great being as all-knowing and all powerful, but actually these are the properties of the people, the persons that make up
right. Yeah.
itself. So,
well, take the argument that he's most famous for, his Kalam cosmological argument, right? All this Trinity stuff goes out the window, and what he's saying is that there has to be a self which chose to bring into existence the cosmos. That's the only kind of explanation that one could have.
Yeah,
that's great for my theology, but not for his.
Yeah. Well, again, I know that some of the critiques is he's inconsistent with himself in other places, like arguing for the soul or with the Kalam. It could be consistent. It's just a matter of him being smart about how he phrases stuff. So he could say that it's consistent with one or more selves that are one being or something like that. So he would just need to, with the Kalam argument, he would just need to be smarter in terms of how he's phrasing stuff. But in terms of your main objection, I do think that it's not problematic.
I don't see how that's just a linguistic problem of how he states it. I mean, he thinks the Trinity is the ultimate source. The Trinity is not a self. It has selves as parts. I'm not sure, that's consistent with the Kalam. The Kalam requires an ultimate source, which is a self. He doesn't have one of those. He fudges it with switching to the parts.
But why does it have to be a self? That could be a misnomer. Like, why couldn't it be selves or something? One being that's a selves. Like, if he just didn't use that word, it has to go back to a self. Like, I don't see why.
Well, okay, so the Kalam view is that there didn't have to be a cosmos. It seems possible for there to be a cosmos or not. And it looks like for something that comes in, something that doesn't have to exist, there needs to be an explanation for why it exists. Yeah. And in fact, he thinks through cosmology, you can show that history only goes finitely backwards in time. So he thinks Big Bang cosmology shows that the cosmos came into existence. And plausibly, he says, for anything that comes into existence, there needs to be a cause for its coming into existence. And there really kind of just conceivably are two kinds of causes, an impersonal cause, which would just sort of operate automatically. And then this would just go back. There would be like an eternal cause for this time-bound cosmos. Or he says it could be a personal agent where the being is able to exercise a power or not, just depending on what it freely chooses. And so, right, that's where you get an agent. It has to be agent causation, basically, is what Craig and Moreland argue. But that's causation by a self. That's what agent causation is.
Yeah.
And now someone like Swinburne, I guess he could just say, well, it's really the Father, but really the Father is the ultimate source and not the Trinity. But he can say that because he has the Father being the source of the Son and the Spirit. So he embraces all that generation and procession tradition.
Yeah. I guess I would just sort of swap. I do sort of see it as just being language. So I would just swap out. So forget about it. You have to argue for an agent singular causation. Let's say you have to go to it proves that there's a personal being. The Trinity as a whole does have the property of being personal. It has three persons that make it up. So I think the issue with the Kalam could be solved by doing something like that. And it only comes down to your main issue of, okay, well, how does the whole gain property? Like, it's not always the case that a whole has certain properties in light of the parts that make it up, but it depends, the degree of unity. And if we're saying God is God, the Trinity, God, is a soul with these three sets of faculties sufficient for personhood, then
I don't think you can say it depends on the degree of unity. I don't think that's in general true. It's just it works for some properties and it doesn't work for others. It depends on what the property is, whether we think it's a fallacy or not. But look, in general, we do think it's a fallacy. Take three selves, okay, and just imagine that they're unified as they could possibly be. You don't get a fourth self out of that, we think. Mm-hmm. You get something that might function like a self, like these three buddies are so close that they could all answer an email together or something, and the person on the other end of the email might think it's one self, but they'd be mistaken. It's really three guys. Yeah, I mean, it looks like it's going to be, this is a problem with social theories generally. It looks like God is going to be an as-if self, something that could be mistaken for a self, something that comes off like one, but something that literally isn't one. And think about apologetics contexts, right? People use the word God in all kinds of ways, right? Sometimes a Buddhist or Hindu will talk about God, and they clearly don't mean it to be a deity or a God, right? They mean some impersonal principle. And so in apologetics context, you'll say, look, the Christian God is personal. And what you mean by that is the Christian God is a self that loves, that has plans, that has knowledge, right? That's what we mean. And when he says God is personal, what he means is it's not a person, but it has persons as parts. This is not a concept of personal that we use. There isn't any other context where we think that persons who form a whole, like a family, for instance, or a group of three best buddies, we don't think that the resulting thing is a person. So I mean, he's just really out of step with Christian tradition, with evangelical tradition, right? Sure. But you're never going to see him preach that God isn't a self. People, God is strictly an it. It's a something. It's a thing. It's a real thing, but it's not a he.
Yeah.
That's just that's crazy talk to the average Christian in the pew. And the reason is the Bible. Because God, the one true God, is a he everywhere in the Bible. It's a I, someone who speaks first person.
Yeah. There are ways to, the biblical debate, obviously we would get into that in another show kind of thing. But yes, there could be. If you're right, that would need to be grappled with, because the philosophical models do have to be consistent with the raw biblical data. And I know that, William Lane Craig, he's aware of this, right? Like he knows that there are different, he'll say that Yahweh refers to the Trinity as a whole, not a he. But there are times where it does use a singular pronoun, and that's taken to be God the Father. So there are two, that's just sort of like a language issue as to figuring out who is Yahweh. Is it God the Father, or is it referring to the Trinity?
Yeah.
So yeah.
I know we're not focusing on the Bible, but I mean, there's a really massive problem here for his view in the Bible, which should really strike you hard the more that you think about it. There, according to textual scholars, all the textual scholars, the evangelical ones, everybody, the term theos in the New Testament, it almost always means the Father. Mm-hmm. You can argue as many as 8 times, maybe it refers to the Son. These are all arguable cases. But still, more than 99% of the time, when they say God, the Father is to be understood. This is just biblical terminology 101. Mm-hmm. And there isn't any term in the Bible which was then understood to refer to the triune God, the Father, Son, and Spirit, whether a description or a name or a title, nothing, right? And what's the chance of that if these are believers in a triune God, that they're only able to refer by their language to the Father and the Son mostly, and they have no word at all, no phrase at all that means the tripersonal God? I mean, the very first thing they would do is they would come up with a way to talk about the tripersonal God, right? That's when the phrase the Trinity, interestingly, in the time of Tertullian, when it's coined, or a little before his time, trios and trinitas, the Greek and Latin terms that we translate Trinity, They just mean a triad. So God is a member of that. The triad is God, the Logos, and the Spirit of God. Later on, around the time of Augustine, a little before, now Trinity comes to be a singular referring term to refer to the one true God. Okay, that's because they were Trinitarians. Okay, that's why you know they're not Trinitarians. That's one of several reasons why you know they're not Trinitarians in the New Testament, because they don't ever refer to this thing. And now if you say the standard apologetics comeback is, look, a concept can be implicit in a source without being explicit. Well, sure. You know, like omnipotence, for instance. I don't think it says, well, it uses the term almighty. You could argue that means omnipotence, but there are going to be divine attributes that aren't explicitly mentioned in Scripture, and you can just try to deduce them from what is said and what isn't said, or even from perfect being theology. That's fine. But yeah, they don't have a word to refer to it, which would be the first thing they would do if they believed in such a thing. And it's not presupposed either. You can understand all these texts without bringing in this triune God idea. But that is something that needs to be argued at greater length for sure.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, awesome. Okay, so yeah, there are, I guess, for the sake of this topic that you're saying, yes, realize the philosophical models have to be consistent with the biblical data and that sort of thing. And nowhere, Dale Tuggy is absolutely right. Nowhere in the Bible does it teach it doesn't teach Trinity Monotheism for sure. It doesn't teach the full-blown doctrine of Nicene, the Trinity, as in the Nicene Creed. That these are developments for sure that have come, and the standard response is, well, there's the raw data. There's what's sufficient in there to derive that doctrine later on and that sort of thing. But yeah, in terms of philosophy, he's absolutely right. We have to make the Bible is primary. That has to guide any models that we come up with. If anything contradicts it, it goes in the garbage type thing. So
right.
Yeah, and I also like on this divide thing. I think it's the model itself is coherent, but we just need to be careful in terms of how we're phrasing the ontological argument, the first premise of the argument, and perhaps we've been a bit sloppy in saying, oh, a max great being is omniscient, is all of these things, or something like that. We should be a little bit, we should phrase things more carefully, and that sort of thing. So,
well, I mean, Craig's model is not obviously incoherent, but I'm inclined to think it is incoherent because, again, he has a thing that in principle couldn't have properties having those properties. So he has the Trinity having properties which only a self could have, and he's explicit that the Trinity is not a self. So I think it has pretty severe problems. I'm also pretty worried about this idea that somehow the persons exist just because the faculties do, and the faculties don't make the soul a person, which is how we normally think about cognitive powers or cognitive and emotional powers.
Yeah. So, and that's sort of your second, the second objection that you mentioned. So, yeah, I'm not sure that. Again, the soul is the substance. Given how you sort of described how the soul is what exemplifies these faculties or brings them about that are sufficient to say that there is a person. One thing I always, this may sound stupid, this is my own idea, so blame me if it doesn't work, but why couldn't the faculties, whenever there's a sufficient amount of faculties themselves, that could give rise to a center of self-consciousness, like sort of an emergent, like in the same way that water wetness emerges out of H2O molecules being a certain thing. Couldn't personhood be apart, like emerge within the soul, and that way you could have multiple sets of faculties and persons within the soul? Like I just see the soul as, for lack of a better word, the stuff that exemplifies these things and brings them into being. It's
I don't I guess I don't think that's obviously impossible, what you said. Although, I mean, it sounds like you've demoted a soul from being, you know, the thing which is the true subject of personal properties to being something like a stuff.
Yeah.
And then, but look, if that's all that this soul is, why can't you have three gods that are composed of the same stuff simultaneously? It's not clear that it should count as monotheism. He wants it not to be a stuff. He wants the soul to be a thing. And partly the reason is that he wants there to be one divine thing. He wants there to be one God. And so the soul being a thing, he thinks, helps to secure monotheism. And then somehow the persons being in that, well, they're not gods. Again, to say that the persons are not gods, that's a huge problem when it comes to the Father in the Bible. But right, this is quite explicit. The Father is the only true God, Jesus says in John 17, 1-3. And Paul says, for us, there's one God, the Father, in 1 Corinthians 8. So you can't have the Father not being a God. But that's his view. I mean, he's trying to make this come out coherent, and he's right that a Trinitarian has to say that the Trinity is the one God. A relative identity person is going to say the Trinity is basically just a plural referring term for the Father, Son, and Spirit collectively, not as one thing, but refers to the three of them, and then you're supposed to say that the persons are the same being but different persons. And most of us who are trained in metaphysics don't think that that's coherent, because to be the same whatever we think implies being the same. And I think Craig would agree with this, by the way.
Yeah.
So if Abe and Abraham are the same man, that means Abe is a man and Abraham is a man, and the one just is the other. Abe just is Abraham, and vice versa. They're numerically identical. So if the Father and Son are the same God, that just means that the Father is a God, the Son is a God, and they're identical. But that you can't say they're identical. That makes nonsense out of the New Testament, right? If the Father and Son were identical, they couldn't ever differ in any way. And anybody, most especially Trinitarians, but any Christian, thinks that the Father and Son have differed from one another. So they can't be, at the same time, they've differed. So they can't be one and the same thing.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, so I guess, obviously, if we take the stuff, immaterial stuff view, there is this, how do we demarcate the soul that is God from other souls that are presumably made of the same immaterial stuff, I guess. So taking sort of the traditional view then, that where the substance is this thinking thing, as I think how you've described it before, and it has these three sets of faculties sufficient for personhood, it would be, I'm still not sure what the issue is, because there would still be there is this thing that is knowing in virtue of its faculties knowing. It's this thing that is exercising these powers and these faculties. So yeah, like I'm not sure.
If the thing, the soul, is the knower, then it is a self. It is, if it's an intentional actor, it is a self. But that's precisely what he doesn't want to say. I mean, Dale, it sounds to me like you're by wanting to treat the one ousia here, what he calls a soul, by suggesting that maybe that's a stuff. It seems to me you're kind of turning in the direction of what I call in my article Constitution Trinitarianism. So the view explored by Mike Ray and Jeff Brower. And I have a paper on that called Constitution, Trinitarianism, and Appraisal. And I have a podcast that's relevant called something like, Does Your Trinity Theory Need Relative Identity? And if you go that route, then you're implicated in relative identity, and then you're denying that principle, that analysis that I said, or when you say that this and that are the same something, that means this is that kind of thing, that is that kind of thing. Oh, and also they're identical. That's precisely what relative identity theorists deny. They think things can be the same something without being the same other sort of thing, because being the same certain thing doesn't require being identical.
Yeah,
that's a hard saying. And again, most philosophers reject it, I think, with good reason. But they would say, people like Ray would say that the metaphysics of physical objects lends some support to these distinctions. They think that things can be the same physical object but different, but not identical. Different entities, you could say.
Gotcha. Yeah, okay, well, that's interesting. Yeah, I learned something there. I think that is something that I'm definitely going to need to rethink in my understanding. And yeah, perhaps Craig is...
Sorry, just to add one thing. Part of the reason why they want to say that the divine substance is not, it's not a thing, it's just a stuff, it's like a stuff, is precisely because they don't want there to be a fourth divine person. Of course, if you just have three divine persons, even though they're so unified and so on, it's not clear why that would be a tripersonal God as opposed to just three gods, you know? Because you're saying they're to be counted as one, but yet you're still admitting that they're different from one another, so they can't be numerically identical.
Yeah, that just becomes, how do we demarcate and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think that's, now that I've stated it or whatever, that's a problematic thing. So my thinking was, I think it was wrong, but again, I want to go back and rethink that. So sticking with Craig's thing, where it's not a stuff, it's this thinking, it's this thing. And it's the soul itself is the knower, but it's knowing in three senses. I don't see why.
Well, he doesn't think the self is the knower. He thinks the self has parts which are knowers. And I mean, I think his view is really that you're supposed to say that it knows because it has parts that know, but it itself doesn't know. Because he realizes that entails that it would be a self. So strictly speaking, the Trinity doesn't know anything, but you're supposed to describe it as knowledgeable or all-knowing because it has parts that are. But that's not clear why, right? Why should that property of a part literally be had by the whole? It looks like it shouldn't. So it looks like we're papering difficulties over with words at this point.
Yeah, that was one of the points I saw in your 9-part blog and that sort of thing, and I was looking for in William Lane Craig to see if he kind of tackled that head on. There is sort of a vagueness as to how it goes back to I guess that point that we were arguing before, where this. Yeah, I guess I don't have a totally good answer for that. I just think that this soul is exercising its three faculties, and it is knowing. It's exemplifying these faculties, which become centers of self-consciousness, perhaps in some kind of emergent way, where and then they are knowing, and the Trinity's knowing in light of having these constituent parts, because it's unified as one substance. I don't really know how to. Yeah.
That's well,
all I'd say.
Dale, there's something we haven't talked about yet, and I think it ties together with a couple of things that we've mentioned. Which there's an interesting exchange between Daniel Howard Snyder and William Lane Craig, and I think it's kind of revealing. And by the way, everybody should read Daniel Howard Snyder. He's in my mind, he's one of the leading Christian philosophers nowadays. He's super brilliant. He was a student of the great Christian philosopher William Alston, who passed away about a decade ago. And he wrote the Trinity entry in the Routledge Encyclopedia, which is well worth your reading. You can find that on his website. But Howard Snyder presses him really hard on the fact that he doesn't think that the one true God is literally knowledgeable. It's not a self. And Howard Snyder just is working from the perspective of perfect being theology. And he's like, come on, this is just the concept of a monotheistic God. It's got to be perfect in every way. And some of those features imply being a self. And Craig throws back really hard. He's like, oh, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, you're crazy to assert so boldly that the concept of God requires a Unitarian understanding. Trinitarians have always denied that God is a single self. And I think he's demonstrably wrong about that because of what we talked about in the beginning. So what's true is that Trinitarians say three persons about the one God. That's demanded by the tradition, right? However you understand that, you have to say that, okay?
Mhm.
That's what he's right about. What he's not right about is that it is his assertion that all Trinitarians have always said that the triune God is not itself a person, because many have thought exactly that for the reasons I talked about in the first part of our conversation. So the ones who say the persons are kind of roles that God plays or personalities of God, and really they think the persons aren't selves, but there's really one divine self there. Those are precisely Trinitarians who think that there's one self and that God is a self and that the persons are less than selves. So it'd be people like Craig is interacting with, Brian Leftow, who's now at Oxford University. He has this very out there Trinity theory on which there is one divine self, but it lives eternally in three different ways, and he calls them life streams, and he thinks those life streams are the persons, but it's really all just one agent, one self, one intelligent being living its life simultaneously in three ways is not a bad way to summarize it. Right. So then, yeah, Craig is just mistaken about that. I think he's getting defensive about his theory, but I think he's not got a broad enough perspective of the landscape.
Yeah, I saw that. And again, as I said, for the audience, I'm going to be linking to both articles, so you can read Daniel Howard Schneider, his 30-page article, and then William Lane Craig has an 11-page response to what Daniel said, and Dale Tuggy's got a response to William Lane Craig's response in his blog. So all of that will be available for people to read for themselves. But yeah, one thing I think we should address is your first objection, because even if we don't have we have a general sense that this Trinity model could be logically coherent. There are some problem areas in terms of, well, how to, equating a substance to self and that sort of thing. But William Lane Craig, we present this model of Cerberus, and you've objected to. Actually, sorry, I just realized this is you're supposed to be probing me. So yeah, did you want to maybe probe?
No, it's a conversation. Just keep going. We're good.
Right. Cool. All right. So yeah, you mentioned Cerberus, and I know in your blogs, this was something that just to be honest, I didn't find. This was a weak thing on your part, in my view, where, okay, so we have Cerberus, and William Lane Craig in his response provides real life two-headed examples, the turtle, a two-headed calf, and that sort of thing, where we have one being, quote unquote, clearly one being, where there are individual persons within that one physical being, and your sort of counter was to say, well, no, this isn't one being with multiple person, turtle persons or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. There are actually multiple beings that are just conjoined. They have overlapping bodies, and you gave the example of Eng and Chen, Chinese.
Yeah, it's really Daniel Howard Schneider I'm stealing this objection from. Yeah. The conjoined twins. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think with the Eng and Chen, they just share their vital organs. I actually agree with you that, yeah, these are clearly two beings that are just conjoined in a certain way. So if we cut them apart, then that's not Trinity Monotheism. It is a different story when it comes to the turtles and that sort of thing, because of the degree of unity. However, when I was even thinking about this, I actually do think that we would think even those turtles, I think you gave an example in this talk of a human with another head just attached at the neck or something like that. And there, William Lane Craig does address
I was giving a real life example. Yeah.
Excellent. So real life examples are even more helpful, for especially because
it's not just a body with an extra head. I said it kind of looks like that, but it's really it's two sisters with overlapping bodies.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I think the thing that helped me see your point is, well, when at the general resurrection, is this the being? Like there's one human being here or something? And no, we would picture God fixing that because they're not supposed to be, right? Human beings, singular.
Yeah.
And I think that William Lane Craig's answer to that is persuasive in my view. He says, yeah, but that's because, look, there's a defect here. And we know from our experience that human beings or turtles are supposed to be they're not supposed to be multi-personal beings. But we could conceive something like Cerberus is by essence meant to be a multi-personal being. And if God is like that in being one soul with a multi-personal being by essence, then that is coherent as well. Even if these real life examples, well actually, though, that isn't a multi-turtle being. That's supposed to be two turtles. So yeah, do you see that difference as being helpful at all? And
I mean, the analogy just doesn't do what he wants it to do. I mean, if we encountered a being like Kerberos, we would think, oh, that's so unfortunate. You know, those three dogs were born with conjoined triplets. And if you just want to specify that it's there's one dog essence there, I mean, not how we understand dogs, right? I mean, dogs aren't persons, but they are supposed to be conscious beings, and it just doesn't look like one. It looks like three of them.
Couldn't we conceive, though,
with not enough body to go around?
When we're talking about conceiving, so yeah, we do know about dogs, so we might infer that looking at Cerberus, that it's the same as the two-headed turtle or the two-headed calf or the two-headed human. But I can conceive of an essence where, pretend we've never seen dogs or anything like that, sort of clouding our judgment. We don't know that dogs are supposed to be singular personal beings. I can conceive of, no, dogs are supposed to be three-headed beings by essence. That's just what the dog kind of thing is, and that seems conceivable to me.
Yeah, I don't think it's obviously impossible, but you know, again, I don't think the analogy does what it was supposed to do. It's not an example that's plausible of a dog with three centers of consciousness. That was the point of the example. Couldn't there be a single being with three centers of consciousness? Yeah, I mean, maybe, but then look, that's a concept of a strange kind of person who has three thinking faculties. I think in a draft of my book chapter, I give a silly thought experiment. You know, you encounter the old magic genie lamp, and he asks you what you wish for, and you say you wish you could think in two different ways. And so the genie snaps his fingers, and now you've got two more brains, and he couldn't think of where else to put them, so he put them in your rear end. So you got a left and right brain, plus you got the one in your head, and now you can think in three different ways. That doesn't make you three persons. That makes you a person who can think in three different ways using three different brains. Maybe your experience would be very bizarre because there would be kind of three, if this is possible, I'm not sure it is, 3 points of view at once. But see, I mean, you see what I'm doing. I have one subject, which is the owner of the three powers. Mm-hmm. And it's those powers that empower me, the subject, to think, right? But I've got three different empowerments. But that's not how he's thinking of this, quote, soul that's God. He doesn't think that those faculties enable God to think in three different ways. He thinks each one of them somehow gives rise to a person. And so then there's three persons that are parts of God.
Yeah, it's definitely, yeah, so there are definitely three owners. And that's the mystery factor that we were addressing in two, that about the centers of consciousness and that sort of thing. So that it's not just that, oh, there's one owner with three sets of faculties. There are three owners in this model. Yeah,
I understand. I mean, here's one way to put it. I understand what it is for a soul to have sufficient powers for being a person. I understand that, right? It's partly cognitive powers, it's partly powers of willing and choosing, powers of relating personally to another. I don't understand what it is for a soul to have faculties that don't make the soul a person, but somehow give rise to a person which is part of that soul. I don't know if that's possible or impossible. It's not anything suggested by Scripture to me either.
Oh, yeah, definitely. No, there's nothing that speaks on this notion or something like that. This language is just foreign to the Bible, so I think that has to be admitted. But yeah, well, that's good. If you're agnostic to it, that means it's an open possibility, assuming that there aren't other problems with it and that sort of thing, as we've been discussing. One thing that I don't think you did bring up, but and it's up to you if you want to go into it all, but I know that Daniel Howard Schneider addresses the diminished divinity problem with this, whereby so Trinity monotheism, just for the audience, so I didn't mention this in my introduction, but it postulates okay, so the divine nature. Dale Tuggy excellently described this, right? So we're talking about a kind nature, so it's all the essential properties of a kind of thing, like a dog kind of thing or a cat kind of thing. And with Trinity monotheism, we do have this weird aspect whereby we want to say that each of the three persons. Okay, so let's start this way. So only the Trinity as a whole is the instantiation of the divine essence, a divine nature. But by the same token, William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland, they don't want to deny that the persons are fully divine. They also have a divine nature.
Well, they paper it over in language, honestly. I mean, to be fully divine is to be a god. That's just like to be fully human is to be a human. So they deny that the persons are fully divine. Only the Trinity is fully divine, which, as Leftow points out, you're not supposed to say that that any of the persons are anything less than fully divine, but they do. So they're going against Catholic tradition when they say that. He calls it Arian. I don't think that's a helpful label, but his point is that it's just some kind of divinity that doesn't entail being a god. He's right about that. That's exactly what the Father, Son, and Spirit are. They're divine, right? They make an analogy with cat parts. The cat is feline, but in a different sense, the tail of the cat or the skeleton of the cat are feline in the sense that they're parts of a cat. And so the persons are divine in that they're parts of something which is divine. Yeah. Okay, but that's just denying that they're fully divine. And this is from somebody who thinks that the most important thing in the world is to say that Jesus is fully divine. So these things don't go together.
To sort of say it the way William Lane Craig talks about this, because he does respond to this issue. So there are two, essentially what the problem is. Look, there are two ways. If this model is Trinity monotheism model is correct, there are two ways to be considered to have a divine nature or to be considered divine. So there's the sense in which the Trinity is divine. That's the full divinity, right? Of which being a triune being is an essential part of. Obviously, God the Father, God the Son, or the Holy Spirit, they're not triune, so they lack this property. So in what sense, how could they be divine if an essential property or aspect is to be triune? Well, they say, well, look, one can have a divine nature in two ways, either by exemplifying the things of the Trinity, or in virtue, the way William Lane Craig will say it is in virtue of another property, like omnipotence, omnipresence, or whatever it is. So in his words, being a distinctive part, not just a part, but a distinctive part of that. And I think he gives the analogy of, with that soccer team player, the persons are parts, distinctive parts of that team, but like it doesn't make sense to say player's nose is even though it's a part of the team, it's not a distinctive part of.
Yeah, but look, this is all purely a verbal save. I mean, this two ways to be divine thing is a distinction made up purely ad hoc to save the theory, right? I could make moves like this as a biblical Unitarian. If you say, Dale, do you believe in the deity of Christ? And I say, well, yes, I do. You say, what? I thought you didn't. Well, no, there's two ways to be divine. One way is to be a God. Yeah, I think only the Father has that, but there's another way to be divine, which is to be the Son of God, who's always doing God's will and who's sent by God. And that's what I mean. That's a perfectly good way to be divine. You're going to say, well, you're just playing with words. We know what the tradition's always meant by being divine. It entails being a God. And you don't think Jesus is divine in that sense. You don't think he's a God. So, all right, to say that the cat skeleton is just as feline as the cat, no, it's not. It's not a cat. You can take this talk of natures and essences. I mean, there's this primary sense of the word in which to be divine is to be a thing of that. In which to have an essence or a nature is to be a thing of that kind. And then there's any number of secondary senses where you're just a thing which is somehow related to that thing with that essence in the primary sense, right? So you can talk about human tastes in food, or human clothes, or human love of music. None of these things are humans, but they're associated with humans. They're distinctive of humans. They're characteristic of things which are human in the primary sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to say that a cat skeleton is divine is just to say that it's the kind of thing, the kind of skeleton which a cat is supposed to have, or something like that. But again, it's just a purely verbal save. They're just preserving the tradition of saying that the persons of the Trinity are divine or fully divine, but they don't mean it. And this is one reason why people like Leftow are just unimpressed, because they think it's important that for instance, the Son should be divine in the sense of being a God, the same God as the Father.
Well, I think, believe it or not, though, I do think that this works to save its coherence, whether one thinks it's ad hoc or not. Perhaps one could further qualify it's not just their distinctive or unique, but they're relevant to the essence. They're essential distinctive parts, or something like that, whereby anyone can. This is unique to God, to the divine kind.
Well, you probably don't want to say a cat skeleton is essential to the cat. I mean, you can come up with some weird scenario where somehow you manage to extract the cat skeleton and you just have this blob cat that's still alive, with no bones. But yeah, look, coherence is not the only issue. And I think sometimes Christian philosophers set the bar way too low. They're just like, hey, if this, is plausibly coherent or isn't obviously incoherent, then I've done my job. But no, there's way more than that that's required. We've already talked about fit with the Bible. That's one thing. Mm-hmm. But look, you can't just come along and say, hey, this is part of this grand, glorious tradition that dates back at least to the Council in 381, if not farther, and then just be saying something different than that tradition. Like that's not honest scholarship.
So do you think Trinitarians have a duty to prove that their models are true in some way? Like, why couldn't it be, like, when I picture the Trinity,
we want our theology to be true, sure.
Yeah, no, but
we need a coherent narrative, for sort of how this fits into church history. That's hard. That's very hard to come up with, and most people don't try that.
Yeah, I think that, there are those elements and that sort of thing, and hopefully, I hope you're enjoying your time. We can definitely, let's do that. Let's address the biblical and historical angles or something in a future show.
Yeah, maybe we can do that another time. I'm gonna need to wrap it up soon, Dale.
All right, so yeah, I think the audience has sort of gotten a good sense of what Trinity Monotheism is and what some of the main issues lodged against it are, and how William Lane Craig and that sort of counter it, and what do those make sense or not. There's one issue that I think I need to rethink and think about on my end from Dale. So I thank you for your take on that. And hopefully you've had a good time on your end there, Dale.
Yeah, good conversation, Dale. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.